Apple earnings. Let's check back in with our senior West Coast correspondent, Jon Erlichman. John.
Thanks, Emily. And to help us go through this very impressive quarter from Apple, we're joined from San Diego by Bloomberg contributing editor Paul Kedrosky, also the infectious greed blogger. And, you know, Paul, in the last couple of weeks, there have been some investor jitters for Apple. And now that we have the results out, do you think those jitters were overblown?
Oh, no, there's no question they were overblown. As a matter of fact, the thing that I think's, most interesting about the earnings, leaving aside their, unbelievably good numbers for the most part, is, you kind of have to ask yourself how this sort of meme took hold, right? How was it that we went from, Apple to 1,000 to, oh my goodness, iPhone sales are likely weak. We need to get out of the stock, 12%, 11% losses in the stock. How did that happen? And it's one of these great sort of, pro-cyclical phenomenon that growth stocks do, where all of a sudden a little bit of weakness, people look for an explanation, they come up with an explanation, they convince themselves of the explanation, and then the explanation becomes self-fulfilling and down the stock goes until they find out they're wrong.
Right. That's a little bit confusing. And what was confusing for investors initially was they came out, they said, great quarter, our outlook kind of soft versus what people are looking for. And then they spent a lot of time in their conference call explaining that they ended up selling a lot more stuff in the first quarter, or technically the second quarter, that ultimately won't make its way into the next quarter. So, I mean, to a certain extent, people trying to determine all this stuff is good, and yet at the same time, maybe it's actually just positive for Apple that they can sell more now, and a lower outlook isn't necessarily a bad thing. But to your point, it's a little confusing.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's part of what's confused investors a little bit. But if you look at the stock in after hours, people weren't really taken too much aback by the the weaker outlook. So I think some of it was people actually saw it as typical Apple gamesmanship with respect to guiding analysts down and then beating them. So a 10% guide down or a 10-cent guide down on earnings really didn't trouble analysts that much, because historically that's at least how much Apple has beaten analyst estimates. So I'd be really surprised if you see estimates move that much.
A few things that Tim Cook highlighted on the call that were interesting. The idea that he hates litigation, which I thought was kind of an interesting comment, considering Apple is going around the world battling everybody in court. But it's more obviously just a positioning statement for a company that is behind the scenes in some pretty brutal legal battles right now.
Yeah, it's reminded me a little bit of like that scene in The Untouchables, whenever De Niro's playing Capone and talking about how much he hates whacking people in the head with baseball bats. I get it, you hate it, just stop hitting me already, right? So it's sort of like that. But yeah, I mean, they've got a big club and they're using it, so not surprisingly, they sort of simultaneously use it and apologize for using it, but they've got it, so they use it.
And as far as where Apple goes from here, I mean, the one point that he tried to make on the call is that if there's anybody out there that has not purchased a smartphone yet, we are the game to beat. And I mean, that's not really a shocker statement, but it is a very, I don't use the word arrogant, but that's a pretty, arrogant comment from the CEO to make.
Yeah, and if you've got it, flaunt it, and they've got it right now. And in particular, what's really interesting, the thing that really stood out to me in that regard was they've got it in Asia. I mean, there was some weakness in Verizon and AT&T sales in the current quarter, and what made up the difference? 5x growth in China market alone. I mean, Asia broadly, but 5x in China. These are standout numbers. So the numbers to watch going forward won't be what someone's whispering to their hedge fund buddy from AT&T and Verizon about domestic iPhone sales. It's going to be what happens in Asia, in particular what happens in China.
Well, speaking about AT&T and Verizon, I mean, he was also taking questions on the call about the carriers and them not being interested in the money that they have to pay back to Apple. And I think this is where Apple can be toughest. And Tim Cook said it. He said, look, when you've got the best product out there and we're focusing on making the best product, then they're going to have to suck it up, And if that means they get a contract over, 24 months and they've got to pay some cash to get it, it's still going to be worth their while.
Yeah, and again, that's exactly how it's played out, that they're willing to make the price concessions up front to subsidize the purchase price in exchange for having these sort of 2-year contracts, and consumers haven't exactly, run away from that idea. So, Apple is in a position where it can ask for those discounts, those subsidies through the carriers, and in turn have that get passed on in the form of 2-year contracts, and nobody's really crying that much. So, again, it's an example of when you're in this kind of, quasi, this dominant, almost quasi-monopolist position in the high end of smartphones, this is the time to exploit it, not to run away from your dominance.
So we just get a snapshot on what's happening inside Apple, or at least its financials. And of course, earlier this week, we found out what was happening with Facebook's financials. What was your reaction to the revisions to their IPO filing about how they did in their first quarter?
You know, it was straight. I mean, the numbers obviously are troubling, but we've talked about those a little bit before. There is this kind of understandable deceleration in the core business, in large part because they don't sell anything off-planet, and they've largely saturated planet Earth from the standpoint of subscriber growth. Something like 1 in 8 people on planet Earth used Facebook in one form or another last quarter. I mean, these are just astonishing numbers. So to grow revenues, you've got to dial it up on a per-user basis, and they're clearly not able to do that without running into people saying, I don't want to be part of this game. I don't want to have, I don't want to be exploited, have my privacy taken, have privacy issues and so on that cause you to drive up revenue growth. And so that's really the game right now, is this really sharp tension between Facebook's need for revenue growth and the average user's unwillingness to give up any more privacy to support that growth.
Do you think then that the Instagram deal, buying Instagram for $1 billion, looks more justified after we see those financials, just so they can say, hey, look at that? The mobile market, that's one of the areas for us?
Yeah, you're forced to do one of 3 things, right? You can turn a revenue dial on your existing customers, which causes privacy compromises. You can grow off planet. You can find someone else to add as subscribers, or you can do organic acquisitions. And Instagram was an example of the latter. The bizarre part in all of this is Instagram wasn't exactly a revelation. We've known about this for months and months. So to do it in the middle of the S1 period, pre-IPO, and perhaps, as some are saying today, cause a delay in the actual IPO itself, is pretty remarkable. I don't know of an example quite like this. At least whenever Google did its IPO and caused itself problems, it was through an interview with Playboy, but it wasn't about doing a very sizable acquisition that caused you to have to go in and do a restatement on an S1. Or not a restatement, but a revision to an S1.
Right. So, Paul, you're a longtime investor in all sorts of technology companies. If you had to pick between Apple and Facebook, which one would it be?
It's an easy decision. I mean, Facebook to me still feels a little bit like the Children's Crusade or Lord of the Flies or something. I mean, I'll let them prove themselves out. Apple's a proven commodity that is executing perfectly on a dominant set of products worldwide. It's an easy decision.